I'm Joe Lombardo, and I am the coordinator of the United National Anti-War Coalition, which is a coalition of anti-war and social justice groups from the United States. So today we're going to be hearing some important voices in the movement on how to bring about a just peace in Ukraine. And what that means is not always clear to everyone, especially in the context of the total blackout of the corporate media of any person or media outlet who differs from the US State Department version of what is the truth in Ukraine. The underlying narrative that you hear from the United States is, and from the corporate media and its social media, is that Russia invaded Ukraine. It did so basically because it is evil and it wants to expand, and it is a country that is run by an evil dictator. This is the narrative that's coming across the United States. It also is that the war started on February 24th of this year. None of that is really the case. The case is that around the time of the Soviet Union, collapse of the Soviet Union, promises were made to Gorbachev that NATO would never expand to the west of Germany. Those promises simply were not kept. This was very important for Russia felt this was very important for its own security. And in fact, 14 of those countries to the east of Germany are now members of NATO, and they wanted the Ukraine to also be a member of NATO. The Ukraine, with a very, very large border with Russia, that could have put nuclear-capable missiles within minutes of Moscow. And so that was a red line that Russia said it could not go along with. It had to stop it with that red line, that Ukraine had to be neutral. We insisted that Ukraine could become part of NATO. Had the United States just said the opposite, this war may have been stopped at that point. The United States recognizes no legitimate security concerns for Russia. Bringing nuclear-capable missiles to the border of Russia, doing war games right on the Russian border, which NATO has done, is kind of the reverse of what we saw with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a red line for the United States. The United States was ready to go to World War III over that. Fortunately, we were able to back down from that position. But the United States has not backed down from the position of bringing Ukraine into NATO. The hot side of the war, the fighting and shooting, also didn't start this year. It started in 2014 when the U.S. helped bring a coup to Kiev, to the capital of Ukraine. What started out as peaceful demonstrations against corruption in Ukraine ended up as a very violent kind of confrontation as neo-Nazis came into Kiev, supported by the United States. People were shot, and the coup was fostered, and the legitimate government of Ukraine was overthrown. That government was headed by a party called the Party of Regions, which was the largest party in Ukraine, which wanted to have better relationships with Russia, as well as Europe. And the United States did not want to see that. And it's one of the reasons we brought the coup in. We heard who became the leader afterwards, first from Victoria Nuland, when she insisted that Arseniy Yatsenyuk become the leader after the coup. He's someone that came from a party that was a right-wing neo-Nazi party that traced its origins back to the Nazi collaborator Stepan Bandera, and he became the leader right after the coup. The two largest parties, the Party of Regions and the Communist Party, were both banned. The Russian language was banned, and there were protests throughout the country against the coup. These were put down by the military, by the police, and by Nazi gangs, most notably in the city of Odessa, where there was a massacre of the people protesting the coup. 48 were killed, hundreds were wounded in that massacre. The Crimea decided it no longer wanted to be part of Ukraine after this and went back to the Soviet Union, went back to Russia, which it had been part of for hundreds of years before the 1950s. There was uprisings throughout the Donbass in the eastern region, and two areas declared themselves independent regions, the People's Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk. Neo-Nazis came into parts of this and tried to put down this with the military. There was fighting that took place in Mariupol, and they were able to take back that area. But the fighting has continued since 2014, and 14,000 people have been killed in that region. That's where the war started. That's not said anywhere. It's simply said it started in the beginning of this year when Russia came in. And what happened in the beginning of this year was Ukraine massed around 150,000 troops on the border of Donbass. They started massive shelling of the independent areas, civilian areas. And then they crossed the line of demarcation into the Donbass area. When Russia saw this, what was happening, they decided to recognize the two independent areas and said they would defend them. Russian troops then came in, and there's been a war going on ever since. So today we want to talk a little bit about what is going on with that war right now. And we also want to talk about what response the anti-war movement should have to this. There's a lot of confusion with this right now on what role we should take and what is happening there. And so we're going to start with this. So I'm going to ask Ajamu Baraka to start this discussion. And I will introduce Ajamu. He is the national organizer of the Black Alliance for Peace, a very significant organization. To have a Black peace organization in the United States is a very significant thing. He serves on the executive committee of the U.S. Peace Council. Both of those groups are members of UNAC. He's on the administrative committee of UNAC, the United National Anti-War Coalition. He is the editor and contributing columnist for Black Agenda Report, another very significant news outlet that has been telling the truth for a long period of time since its founding. And he's a contributing columnist to Counterpunch. He was recently awarded the U.S. Peace Memorial Award in 2019 and the Serena Sim Award for Uncompromising Integrity in Journalism. So we're first going to ask Ajamu to speak.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joe. And thank everyone who showed up this afternoon to engage in this very important conversation. As Joe just indicated, we have some challenges as a peace movement, as an anti-imperialist movement, as a consequence of this conflict in Ukraine. We don't have to talk about the fact that this conflict has initiated some very serious tensions among the pro-peace and anti-war and anti-imperialist elements in this country and really throughout the Western world. And so these kinds of conversations that allow us to talk among ourselves, to struggle through the various positions, to see if we can find a minimal program that will allow us to reconstitute and concentrate our power in order that we are more effective in trying to move toward a world in which there will be no more interstate violence, no more war, where there can in fact be peace. That is vitally important. In fact, I will argue it is our primary responsibility as human beings and as members of this community. Now, I'm not going to get into all of the issues around, as we say, who shot John. That is, how we got into this situation with this conflict. I'll just share this, though, that from our analysis, that is those of us in the Black Alliance for Peace, we say at minimum that this conflict could have and should have been avoided, that the war did not start in February. And in fact, this conflict, as it unfolded through 2021, we define as a manufactured conflict. But we don't want to even debate that, because our position is this. If you really want to understand Ukraine, we say we need to decenter Europe and focus on imperialism. That the issue for us is, in fact, imperialism and the length that it will take. And imperialism we define basically as the imperialist states that we see as the primary drivers of instability, the primary threats to international peace, we see emanating primarily from the West, under the hegemony, under the leadership, if you will, of the United States of America. And we see the lengths that the US would go. We see how dangerous the current environment is today. As a consequence of trying to galvanize European solidarity against Russia, we see that agreements have been made to allow Germany to basically rearm. We see that the Japanese are moving toward rearming. We see the kind of belligerence that emanated from the meetings between President Biden and the new president in South Korea, vis-a-vis North Korea. We see the kinds of moves being made on the African continent, where the US has encouraged its vassal states like Rwanda and Uganda to begin to be the police of the eastern and southern parts of the African continent. We see that Biden has expanded or redeployed US troops back to Somalia, even after Trump took troops out. And even after it appears once again that they were moving in Somalia toward an African solution to an African problem. But of course, you can't do that when you're still under the heels of the global North and the hegemon of the United States of America. So troops are going back to Somalia. On the African continent, they have the audacity under this bill by Gregory Meeks to impose on African states that they are not able to exercise their own sovereignty, their own foreign policy. That this bill that is being pushed is that if you don't do what George Bush said around the Iraqi war, if you're not, either with the US, then you are opposed to the US. So if you don't accept the definitions of how the Ukrainian situation is being defined, if you don't embrace and include yourself, your national interests with those of the West, then you're going to be punished by the United States of America. And keep in mind and remind ourselves, these sanctions, this arbitrary gangsterism, this is just what it is. It's gangsterism. These are criminal acts. They are illegal. And we need to remind ourselves of that and remind this movement of that. The subversion in Latin America, the Summit of the Americas coming up, where the US arbitrarily decides that they're not going to invite Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. This is the situation that we are facing, that with this effort to maintain global hegemony, it doesn't matter what kind of impact this conflict has on anyone. They know that basically this conflict is going to have, is having a detrimental impact on the entire world. that basically we know there's going to be almost 500 million Africans who are being negatively impacted by this war. We know that they have shifted the burden, the cost of this war to the working class in the US with inflation, with higher gas and food prices, while these criminals that own and control the military-industrial complex are making record profits. So my friends, we have before us a real task. But not only do you have this instability and this dangerous international situation, domestically, we have a growing dangerous situation, because when you have aggressive militarism externally, you have to have containment domestically. And we see that under the war party, the Democrats, we see that there's more money for the police. We see the moves being made to increase censorship, surveillance, and repression. And we see this dangerous phenomenon of the Democrats and everybody else whitewashing the existence of literal neo-Nazis in Ukraine and attempted to try to reframe these white supremacist ultra-nationalists in that state, pretending like it doesn't exist, or it's the creation of the figment of Putin's imagination. Where just a few months ago, they were talking about how corrupt and how dangerous those forces were in Ukraine. So we can't play with this, because we understand that these folks are committed to maintaining the hegemony. They say it basically in their documents. The national security strategy of the US says it's committed to the doctrine of full spectrum dominance. It's clear. So when people began to make this equivalency between US and Western imperialism and the imperialism of Russia with their $1.9 trillion and their few bases outside of their sphere of influence versus the US with its $21 trillion, 800 to 1,000 bases, it makes no sense, because basically what you are doing, you're disarming opposition, you're confusing people, you are disrupting and making it more difficult for us to mobilize against the primary enemy, the primary threat to international peace. So we say in Black Alliance for Peace, we are so glad that we are part of UNAC, because UNAC is upholding the anti-imperialist perspective. We embrace and we love our pro-peace colleagues. We believe it's important that we have a commitment to peace. We are committed to peace also, but we understand that what we're up against now, what we are in fact fighting against, is not being driven by morality. It's being driven by material interests. And the material interest of the West right now is to maintain their global hegemony. And we have to understand that, because we have to understand that we're not going to be able to eliminate war in this country and globally. We can't construct the conditions for peace until we take power from these perpetrators of violence. They have declared war on humanity.
2 minutes left.
They have declared war on humanity. And we have to understand what, in fact, we're up against. We say this imperialist war is being waged against collective humanity. We need to take the opportunity to turn these imperialist wars into wars against imperialism. We have to build movement, my friends. We encourage everyone who's concerned about war, who want to see its elimination, who want to see the possibility of a new society, join an organization that's fighting for societal transformation. Struggle as though your life depended on it, because it does. When we do that, when we commit ourselves to a new vision of what we can be as human beings, when we understand that we can in fact put the planet and people and peace before profits, we would be well on the way of developing the conditions to transform ourselves and this world. And we can say then, with that slogan we always use, all power to the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamal. Just to let people know, I turned off the chat because there was a whole lot of back and forth, some arguing going on. That's a good thing to do on Facebook, but it's not good to do while there are speakers speaking. It's disrespectful. If you have questions of the speakers, I'd urge you to put them in the question and answer area, which you can find on the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So I'd now like to introduce our second speaker, who is Sarah Flounders. She's the co-coordinator of the International Action Center. She's a writer for the Workers' World newspaper. She's a member of the UNAC Administrative Committee, the author of several books, and she has traveled extensively in countries that have been under attack by US imperialism to report and express solidarity with them. So next we'll hear from Sarah.
Well, thank you, Joe, and thank you to UNAC for organizing this discussion. I want to open by saying I so agree with Ajamu that imperialism is the instigator. We are not in a new Cold War, a long stalemate stretching decades. We are in a world war, an enormously dangerous war that is not just a conflict in Donbass. The whole world is at risk of famines that are predicted to sweep whole continents, supply chain disruptions of the most essential medicines. This war in Ukraine is a turning point, a watershed, a huge change vibrating around the world. There's a fragmentation and a realignment, and US imperialism will not allow any country to be neutral. The US and EU sanctions will create famines throughout Africa. UN agencies are making ominous warnings of the impact of inflation and shortages in the whole developing world. US sanctions against India are threatened under the Countering America Adversities through Sanctions Act. There's more US sanctions threatened and already imposed on Turkey, a NATO member, for their continuing trade with Russia. And after Pakistan continued its trade, Washington orchestrated a coup against the government of Imran Khan. US sanctions on more than 40 countries already disrupt the economy and the lives of millions of people in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. Now, who pays the price inside the US? Really, the cost of US militarism and the military offensives will wipe out all of President Biden's election promises and the gains of past generations of workers' struggles. Build back better infrastructure programs, that's off the table. COVID relief, preparation for other health emergencies, student debt relief, every other promised social program, environmental program is off the agenda. The challenge for us is, can the working class in the US and in Europe intervene with our own demands in this challenge? That is the challenge. And let's be clear, US corporate war is not in our interests. International solidarity, the struggle against racism, the struggle against US wars can be a powerful weapon if it's organized. Now, the war in Ukraine is a military struggle, and Russia has made some gains. It's a political struggle. Finland and Norway are being roped into the NATO war machine with no vote of their own population, no consultation even with other NATO countries. But war in this imperialist era are fundamentally about economics. It's economic interests that drive nation states to war. And what do the US corporations want out of this war? That's what we should look at. It was planned for years. Ukraine is the war front of NATO's choosing, not of Russia's. It's a proxy, yes, in a struggle to gain supremacy over its allies in the European Union, and to forcibly de-link Russia from its extensive and mutually profitable trade with Europe. US policy is seeking now to grind down Russia's resources in a long and costly military onslaught. The US has instigated the crisis by encircling Russia with NATO bases, organizing constant military operations, supplying weapons to Ukraine to fire near Russia's border for 8 years. Washington orchestrated the color revolution, as it's called, in Ukraine in 2004, before its far more extreme coup in 2014 using fascist forces. Thousands of US NATO military trainers, mercenaries, and equipment has already destroyed Ukraine's neutrality. Ukraine is a de facto member of the US commanded NATO military alliance. Make no mistake. The problem is that even after the 2014 coup and the US sanctions at that time, the trade continued and actually escalated between Russia and the EU, to the great frustration of US strategists. There was still a growing integration of the EU trade and investment with Russia and with China. This favorable trade challenges the domination of US corporate power in Europe, and it challenges US global hegemony. The immediate threat to US hegemony is that the EU trade with Russia was at $260 billion a year, 10 times the EU trade with the US. And the European Union was the largest investor in Russia. So breaking this growing economic integration of the EU with Russia, and at an even greater level with China, serves the long-term strategic interests of US corporate domination that has been in place since World War II. US government strategists are using sanctions as a wrecking ball to demolish the globalized economy. For 40 years, globalization was promoted in a unipolar world. So this war is a desperate struggle to preserve US global hegemony, and they will destroy what they have built because if it's not now in their immediate interests. How dangerous. The policy of consciously demolishing supply chains of essential products, grain, fertilizer, energy, it amounts to a reckless war on defenseless civilian populations. US sanctions disrupt trade worldwide, send shockwaves far beyond the countries directly targeted. President Biden said as much in a Brussels NATO press conference. He said, food shortages, it's going to be real. The price of sanctions is not just imposed upon Russia, it's imposed upon an awful lot of countries as well, including European countries and our country as well. Direct quote. His ominous warning, for the first time, this intentional disruption is hitting the countries imposing the sanctions. It's creating unprecedented inflation, the highest in 40 years and climbing, supply chain chaos, sharply higher costs for energy, for industries, transport, homes. And look at the stock market slide right here. There's British predictions that 40% of their population will have to choose between eating and heating. What a choice. Washington is demanding that countries act against their own economic interests and enforce sanctions passed as US legislation in which they had no voice or prior notice. Now, why is Russia targeted? Russia has a capitalist economy that's much smaller than the US, the world's largest economy. Russia also confronts the economic power of not just the US, but the combined economic power of the EU, Japan, South Korea, Australia. The Russian economy today is smaller than Canada or the South Korean economy.